Chapter 7 of Prester John. This recording is in the public domain. Prester John by John Buchan. Chapter 7. Captain Arcoll tells a tale. It froze in the night, harder than was common on the Berg even in winter, and as I crossed the road next morning it was covered with rime. All my fears had gone, and my mind was strung high with expectation. 5 pencilled words may seem a small thing to build hope on, but it was enough for me, and I went about my work in the store with a reasonably light heart. One of the first things I did was to take stock of our armoury. There were 5 sporting Mausers of a cheap make, 1 Mauser pistol, a Lee Speed carbine, and a little nickel-plated revolver. There was also Japp's shotgun, an old hammered breech-loader, as well as the gun I had brought out with me. There was a good supply of cartridges, including a stock for a .400 Express which could not be found. I pocketed the pistol and searched till I discovered a good sheath knife. If fighting was in prospect, I might as well look to my arms. All the morning I sat among flour and sugar, possessing my soul in as much patience as I could command. Nothing came down the white road from the west. The sun melted the rime. The flies came out and buzzed in the window. Japp got himself out of bed and brewed strong coffee, and went back to his slumbers. Presently it was dinner time, and I went over to a silent meal with Wardlaw. When I returned I must have fallen asleep over a pipe, for the next thing I knew I was blinking drowsily at the patch of sun in the door and listening for footsteps. In the dead stillness of the afternoon I thought I could discern a shuffling in the dust. I got up and looked out, and there, sure enough, was someone coming down the road. But it was only a Kaffir, and a miserable-looking object at that. I had never seen such an anatomy. It was a very old man, bent almost double, and clad in a ragged shirt and a pair of foul khaki trousers. He carried an iron pot, and a few belongings were tied up in a dirty handkerchief. He must have been a Dacca smoker, for he coughed hideously, twisting his body with the paroxysms. I had seen the type before, the old broken-down native who had no kin to support him and no tribe to shelter him. They wander about the roads, cooking their wretched meals by their little fires, till one morning they are found stiff under a bush. The native gave me good day in Kaffir, then begged for tobacco or a handful of mealie meal. I asked him where he came from. From the west, Inkoos, he said, and before that from the south. It is a sore road for old bones. I went into the store to fetch some meal, and when I came out he had shuffled close to the door. He had kept his eyes on the ground, but now he looked up at me, and I thought he had very bright eyes for such an old wreck. "The nights are cold, Inkoos," he wailed, "and my folk are scattered, and I have no kraal. The aasvogels follow me, and I can hear the blesbok." "What about the blesbok?" I asked with a start. "The blesbok are changing ground," he said, and looked me straight in the face. "And where are the hunters?" I asked. "They are here, and behind me," he said in English, holding out his pot for my meal, while he began to edge into the middle of the road. I followed, and speaking English asked him if he knew of a man called Collis. "I come from him, young boss." "Where is your house?" "Ah, the school. There will be a way in by the back window? See that it is open, for I'll be there shortly." Then lifting up his voice he called down in Sesotho all manner of blessings on me for my kindness, and went shuffling down the sunlit road, coughing like a volcano. In high excitement I locked up the store and went over to Mr. Wardlaw. No children had come to school that day, and he was sitting idle, playing patience. "Lock the door," I said, "and come into my room. We're on the brink of explanations." In about 20 minutes the bush below the back window parted and the Kaffir slipped out. He grinned at me and after a glance round hopped very nimbly over the sill. Then he examined the window and pulled the curtains. "Is the outer door shut?" he asked in excellent English. "Well, get me some hot water, and any spare clothes you may possess, Mr. Crawfurd. I must get comfortable before we begin our indaba. We've the night before us, so there's plenty of time. But get the house clear, and see that nobody disturbs me at my toilet. I am a modest man, and sensitive about my looks." I brought him what he wanted, and looked on at an amazing transformation. Taking a phial from his bundle, he rubbed some liquid on his face and neck and hands, and got rid of the black colouring. His body and legs he left untouched, save that he covered them with shirt and trousers from my wardrobe. Then he pulled off a scaly wig and showed beneath it a head of close-cropped grizzled hair. In 10 minutes the old Kaffir had been transformed into an active, soldierly-looking man of maybe 50 years. Mr. Wardlaw stared as if he had seen a resurrection. "I had better introduce myself," he said, when he had taken the edge off his thirst and hunger. "My name is Arcoll, Captain James Arcoll. I am speaking to Mr. Crawford, the storekeeper, and Mr. Wardlaw, the schoolmaster of Blaauwildebeestefontein. Where, by the way, is Mr. Peter Japp? Drunk? Ah, yes, it was always his failing. The quorum, however, is complete without him." By this time it was about sunset, and I remember I cocked my ear to hear the drums beat. Captain Arcoll noticed the movement as he noticed all else. "You're listening for the drums, but you won't hear them. That business is over here. Tonight they beat in Swaziland and down into the Tonga border. 3 days more, unless you and I, Mr. Crawford, are extra smart, and they'll be hearing them in Durban." It was not till the lamp was lit, the fire burning well, and the house locked and shuttered, that Captain Arcoll began his tale. "First," he said, "let me hear what you know. Collis told me that you were a keen fellow, and had wind of some mystery here. You wrote him about the way you were spied on, but I told him to take no notice. Your affair, Mr. Crawford, had to wait on more urgent matters. Now, what do you think is happening?" I spoke very shortly, weighing my words, for I felt I was on trial before these bright eyes. "I think that some kind of native rising is about to commence." "Ay," he said dryly, "you would, and your evidence would be the spying and drumming. Anything more?" "I have come on the tracks of a lot of IDB work in the neighbourhood. The natives have some supply of diamonds, which they sell bit by bit, and I don't doubt but they have been getting guns with the proceeds." He nodded. "Have you any notion who has been engaged in the job?" I had it on my tongue to mention Japp, but forbore, remembering my promise. "I can name one," I said, "a little yellow Portugoose who calls himself Henriques or Hendricks. He passed by here the day before yesterday." Captain Arcoll suddenly was consumed with quiet laughter. "Did you notice the Kaffir who rode with him and carried his saddlebags? Well, he's one of my men. Henriques would have a fit if he knew what was in those saddlebags. They contain my change of clothes and other odds and ends. Henriques' own stuff is in a hole in the spruit. A handy way of getting one's luggage sent on, eh? The bags are waiting for me at a place I appointed." And again Captain Arcoll indulged his sense of humour. Then he became grave and returned to his examination. "A rising, with diamonds as the sinews of war, and Henriques as the chief agent. Well and good, but who is to lead, and what are the natives going to rise about? I know nothing further, but I have made some guesses." "Let's hear your guesses," he said, blowing smoke rings from his pipe. "I think the main mover is a great black minister who calls himself John Laputa." Captain Arcoll nearly sprang out of his chair. "Now how on earth did you find that out? Quick, Mr. Crawford, tell me all you know, for this is desperately important." I began at the beginning, and told him the story of what happened on the Kirkcaple shore. Then I spoke of my sight of him on board ship, his talk with Henriques about Blaauwildebeestefontein, and his hurried departure from Durban. Captain Arcoll listened intently, and at the mention of Durban he laughed. "You and I seem to have been running on lines which nearly touched. I thought I had grabbed my friend Laputa that night in Durban, but I was too cocksure and he slipped off. Do you know, Mr. Crawford, you have been on the right trail long before me. When did you say you first saw him at his devil worship? 7 years ago? Then you were the first man alive to know the Reverend John in his true colours. You knew 7 years ago what I only found out last year." "Well, that's my story," I said. "I don't know what the rising is about, but there's one other thing I can tell you. There is some kind of sacred place for the Kaffirs, and I've found out where it is." I gave him a short account of my adventures in the Rooirand. He smoked silently for a bit after I had finished. "You've got the skeleton of the whole thing right, and you only want the filling up. And you found out everything for yourself. Collis was right. You're not wanting in intelligence, Mr. Crawford." It was not much of a compliment, but I have never been more pleased in my life. This slim, grizzled man, with his wrinkled face and bright eyes, was clearly not lavish in his praise. I felt it was no small thing to have earned a word of commendation. "And now I will tell you my story," said Captain Arcoll. "It is a long story, and I must begin far back. It has taken me years to decipher it, and remember, I've been all my life at this native business. I can talk every dialect, and I have the customs of every tribe by heart. I've travelled over every mile of South Africa, and Central and East Africa too. I was in both the Matabele wars, and I've seen a heap of other fighting which never got into the papers. So what I tell you, you can take as gospel, for it is knowledge that was not learned in a day." He puffed away and then asked suddenly, "Did you ever hear of Prester John?" "The man that lived in Central Asia?" I asked, with a reminiscence of a storybook I had as a boy. "No, no," said Mr. Wardlaw. "He means the King of Abyssinia in the 15th century. I've been reading all about him. He was a Christian, and the Portuguese sent expedition after expedition to find him, but they never got there. Albuquerque wanted to make an alliance with him and capture the Holy Sepulchre." Arcoll nodded. "That's the one I mean. There's not very much known about him, except Portuguese legends. He was a sort of Christian, but I expect that his practices were as pagan as his neighbours. There is no doubt that he was a great conqueror. Under him and his successors the empire of Ethiopia extended far south of Abyssinia, away down to the Great Lakes." "How long did this power last?" I asked, wondering to what tale this was prologue. "That's a mystery no scholar has ever been able to fathom. Anyhow, the centre of authority began to shift southward, and the warrior tribes moved in that direction. At the end of the 16th century, the chief native power was round about the Zambesi. The Mazimba and the Makaranga had come down from the Lake Nyassa quarter, and there was a strong kingdom in Manicaland. That was the Monomotapa that the Portuguese thought so much of." Wardlaw nodded eagerly. The story was getting into ground that he knew about. "The thing to remember is that all these little empires thought themselves the successors of Prester John. It took me a long time to find this out, and I've spent days in the best libraries in Europe over it. They all looked back to a great king in the north, whom they called by about 20 different names. They had forgotten all about his Christianity, but they remembered that he was a conqueror. Well, to make a long story short, Monomotapa disappeared in time, and fresh tribes came down from the north, and pushed right down to Natal and the Cape. That is how the Zulus first appeared. They brought with them the story of Prester John, but by this time it had ceased to be a historical memory, and had become a religious cult. They worshipped a great power who had been their ancestor, and the favourite Zulu word for him was Umkulunkulu. The belief was perverted into 50 different forms, but this was the central creed, that Umkulunkulu had been the father of the tribe, and was alive as a spirit to watch over them. They brought more than a creed with them. Somehow or other, some fetish had descended from Prester John by way of the Mazimba and Angoni and Makaranga. What it is I do not know, but it was always in the hands of the tribe which for the moment held the leadership. The great native wars of the 16th century, which you can read about in the Portuguese historians, were not for territory, but for leadership, and mainly for the possession of this fetish. Anyhow, we know that the Zulus brought it down with them. They called it Ndlondlo, which means the great snake, but I don't suppose that it was any kind of snake. The snake was their totem, and they would naturally call their most sacred possession after it. Now I will tell you a thing that few know. You have heard of Shaka. He was a sort of black Napoleon early in the last century, and he made the Zulus the paramount power in South Africa, slaughtering about 2 million souls to accomplish it. Well, he had the fetish, whatever it was, and it was believed that he owed his conquests to it. Mozilakatsa tried to steal it, and that was why he had to fly to Matabele land. But with Shaka it disappeared. Dingaan did not have it, nor Panda, and Cetewayo never got it, though he searched the length and breadth of the country for it. It had gone out of existence, and with it the chance of a Kaffir empire. Captain Arcoll got up to light his pipe, and I noticed that his face was grave. He was not telling us this yarn for our amusement. "So much for Prester John and his charm," he said. "Now I have to take up the history at a different point. In spite of risings here and there, and occasional rows, the Kaffirs have been quiet for the better part of half a century. It is no credit to us. They have had plenty of grievances, and we are no nearer understanding them than our fathers were. But they are scattered and divided. We have driven great wedges of white settlements into their territory, and we have taken away their arms. Still, they are 6 times as many as we are, and they have long memories, and a thoughtful man may wonder how long the peace will last. I have often asked myself that question, and till lately I used to reply, forever, because they cannot find a leader with the proper authority, and they have no common cause to fight for. But a year or 2 ago I began to change my mind. It is my business to act as chief intelligence officer among the natives. Well, one day I came on the tracks of a curious person. He was a Christian minister called Laputa, and he was going among the tribes from Durban to the Zambesi as a roving evangelist. I found that he made an enormous impression, and yet the people I spoke to were chary of saying much about him. Presently I found that he preached more than the gospel. His word was Africa for the Africans, and his chief point was that the natives had had a great empire in the past, and might have a great empire again. He used to tell the story of Prester John with all kinds of embroidery of his own. You see, Prester John was a good argument for him, for he had been a Christian as well as a great potentate. For years there has been plenty of this talk in South Africa, chiefly among Christian Kaffirs. It is what they call Ethiopianism, and American Negroes are the chief apostles. For myself, I always thought the thing perfectly harmless. I don't care a fig whether the native missions break away from the parent churches in England and call themselves by fancy names. The more freedom they have in their religious life, the less they are likely to think about politics. But I soon found out that Laputa was none of your flabby, educated Negroes from America, and I began to watch him. I first came across him at a revival meeting in London, where he was a great success. He came and spoke to me about my soul, but he gave up when I dropped into Zulu. The next time I met him was on the lower Limpopo, when I had the honour of trying to shoot him from a boat. Captain Arcoll took his pipe from his mouth and laughed at the recollection. I had got on to an IDB gang, and to my amazement found the evangelist among them. But the Reverend John was too much for me. He went overboard in spite of the crocodiles, and managed to swim below water to the reed bed at the side. However, that was a valuable experience for me, for it gave me a clue. I next saw him at a missionary conference in Cape Town, and after that at a meeting of the Geographical Society in London, where I had a long talk with him. My reputation does not follow me home, and he thought I was an English publisher with an interest in missions. You see, I had no evidence to connect him with IDB, and besides I fancied that his real game was something bigger than that, so I just bided my time and watched. I did my best to get on to his dossier, but it was no easy job. However, I found out a few things. He had been educated in the States, and well educated too, for the man is a good scholar and a great reader, besides the finest natural orator I have ever heard. There was no doubt that he was of Zulu blood, but I could get no traces of his family. He must come of high stock, for he is a fine figure of a man. Very soon I found it was no good following him in his excursions into civilization. There he was merely the educated Kaffir, a great pet of missionary societies, and a favourite speaker at church meetings. You will find evidence given by him in blue books on native affairs, and he counted many members of Parliament at home among his correspondents. I let that side go, and resolved to dog him when on his evangelizing tours in the Backveld. For 6 months I stuck to him like a leech. I am pretty good at disguises, and he never knew who was the broken-down old Kaffir who squatted in the dirt at the edge of the crowd when he spoke, or the half-caste who called him sir and drove his Cape cart. I had some queer adventures, but these can wait. The gist of the thing is that after 6 months, which turned my hair grey, I got a glimmering of what he was after. He talked Christianity to the mobs in the kraals, but to the indunas he told a different story. Captain Arcoll helped himself to a drink, You can guess what that story was, Mr. Crawford. At full moon, when the black cock was blooded, the Reverend John forgot his Christianity. He was back 4 centuries among the Mazimba, sweeping down on the Zambesi. He told them, and they believed him, that he was the Mkulunkulu, the incarnated spirit of Prester John. He told them that he was there to lead the African race to conquest and empire. Aye, and he told them more, for he has, or says he has, the great snake itself, the necklet of Prester John. Neither of us spoke. We were too occupied with fitting this news into our chain of knowledge. Captain Arcoll went on. Now that I knew his purpose, I set myself to find out his preparations. It was not long before I found a mighty organization at work from the Zambesi to the Cape. The great tribes were up to their necks in the conspiracy, and all manner of little sects had been taken in. I have sat at tribal councils and been sworn a blood brother, and I have used the secret password to get knowledge in odd places. It was a dangerous game, and as I have said, I had my adventures, but I came safe out of it, with my knowledge. The first thing I found out was that there was a great deal of wealth somewhere among the tribes. Much of it was in diamonds, which the labourers stole from the mines and the chiefs impounded. Nearly every tribe had its secret chest, and our friend Laputa had the use of them all. Of course the difficulty was changing the diamonds into coin, and he had to start IDB on a big scale. Your pal Henriques was the chief agent for this, but he had others at Mozambique and Johannesburg, aye, and in London, whom I have on my list. With the money, guns and ammunition were bought, and it seems that a pretty flourishing trade has been going on for some time. They came in mostly overland, through Portuguese territory, though there have been cases of consignments to Johannesburg houses, the contents of which did not correspond with the invoice. You ask what the governments were doing to let this go on. Yes, and you may well ask. They were all asleep. They never dreamed of danger from the natives, and in any case it was difficult to police the Portuguese side. Laputa knew our weakness, and he staked everything on it. My first scheme was to lay Laputa by the heels, but no government would act on my information. The man was strongly buttressed by public support at home, and South Africa has burned her fingers before this with arbitrary arrests. Then I tried to fasten IDB on him, but I could not get my proofs till too late. I nearly had him in Durban, but he got away, and he never gave me a second chance. For 5 months he and Henriques have been lying low, because their scheme was getting very ripe. I have been following them through Zululand and Gazaland, and I have discovered that the train is ready, and only wants the match. For a month I have never been more than 5 hours behind him on the trail, and if he has laid his train, I have laid mine also. Arcoll's whimsical, humorous face had hardened into grimness, and in his clear eyes there was the light of a fierce purpose. The sight of him comforted me, in spite of his tale. But what can he hope to do? I asked. Though he roused every Kaffir in South Africa, he would be beaten. You say he is an educated man. He must know that he has no chance in the long run. I said he was an educated man, but he is also a Kaffir. He can see the first stage of a thing, and maybe the second, but no more. That is the native mind. If it was not like that, our chance would be the worse. You say the scheme is ripe, I said. How ripe? Arcoll looked at the clock. In half an hour's time, Laputa will be with Mpefu. There he will stay the night. Tomorrow morning he goes to Umvelos to meet Henriques. Tomorrow evening the gathering begins. One question, I said. How big a man is Laputa? The biggest thing the Kaffirs have ever produced. I tell you, in my opinion, he is a great genius. If he had been white he might have been a second Napoleon. He is a born leader of men, and as brave as a lion. There is no villainy he would not do if necessary, and yet I should hesitate to call him a blackguard. Aye, you may look surprised at me, you two pragmatical Scotsmen, but I have, so to speak, lived with the man for months, and there's fineness and nobility in him. He would be a terrible enemy, but a just one. He has the heart of a poet and a king, and it is God's curse that he has been born among the children of Ham. I hope to shoot him like a dog in a day or two, but I am glad to bear testimony to his greatness. "If the rising starts tomorrow," I asked, "have you any of his plans?" He picked up a map from the table and opened it. "The first rendezvous is somewhere near Sikitola's. Then they move south, picking up contingents, and the final concentration is to be on the high veld near Amsterdam, which is convenient for the Swazis and the Zulus. After that I know nothing, but of course there are local concentrations along the whole line of the Berg from Mashonaland to Basutoland. Now look here. To get to Amsterdam they must cross the Delagoa Bay Railway. Well, they won't be allowed to. If they get as far they will be scattered there. As I told you, I too have laid my train. We have the police ready all along the scarp of the Berg. Every exit from native territory is watched, and the frontier farmers are out on commando. We have regulars on the Delagoa Bay and Natal lines, and a system of field telegraphs laid which can summon further troops to any point. It has all been kept secret because we are still in the dark ourselves. The newspaper public knows nothing about any rising, but in 2 days every white household in South Africa will be in a panic. Make no mistake, Mr. Crawford, this is a grim business. We will smash Laputa and his men, but it will be a fierce fight, and there will be much good blood shed. Besides, it will throw the country back another half-century. Would to God I had been man enough to put a bullet through his head in cold blood. But I could not do it. It was too like murder, and maybe I shall never have the chance now. "There's one thing puzzles me," I said. "What makes Laputa come up here to start with? Why didn't he begin with Zululand?" "God knows. There's sure to be sense in it, for he does nothing without reason. We may know tomorrow." But as Captain Arcoll spoke, the real reason suddenly flashed into my mind. Laputa had to get the Great Snake, the necklet of Prester John, to give his leadership prestige. Apparently he had not yet got it, or Arcoll would have known. He started from this neighbourhood because the fetish was somewhere hereabouts. I was convinced that my guess was right, but I kept my own counsel. "Tomorrow Laputa and Henriques meet at Umvelos', probably at your new store, Mr. Crawford. And so the ball commences." My resolution was suddenly taken. I think I said I had better be present at the meeting, as representing the firm. Captain Arcoll stared at me and laughed. "I had thought of going myself," he said. "Then you go to certain death, disguise yourself as you please. You cannot meet them in the store as I can. I'm there on my ordinary business, and they will never suspect. If you're to get any news, I'm the man to go." He looked at me steadily for a minute or so. "I'm not sure that's such a bad idea of yours. I would be better employed myself on the Berg, and as you say, I would have little chance of hearing anything. You're a plucky fellow, Mr. Crawford. I suppose you understand that the risk is pretty considerable." "I suppose I do, but since I'm in this thing I may as well see it out. Besides, I've an old quarrel with our friend Laputa." "Good and well," said Captain Arcoll. "Draw in your chair to the table then, and I'll explain to you the disposition of my men. I should tell you that I have loyal natives in my pay in most tribes, and can count on early intelligence. We can't match their telepathy, but the new type of field telegraph is not so bad, and may be a trifle more reliable." Till midnight we pored over maps, and certain details were burned on my memory. Then we went to bed and slept soundly, even Mr. Wardlaw. It was strange how fear had gone from the establishment, now that we knew the worst and had a fighting man by our side. Chapter 7